The information provided on this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and does not constitute financial, investment, tax, or legal advice. Investing involves risk, including the loss of principal. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Any investment decisions you make are solely your responsibility. You should consult with a professional to determine what may be best for your individual needs. Here in the upper Midwest, a lot of us are connected to agriculture in one way or another. My mom, for example, grew up on a farm in southern Minnesota, and now one of my cousins lives on a family farm in northwestern Minnesota. Still, those of us who don't live and work in agriculture from day to day may not realize how the industry has transformed in recent years. Automation has opened new possibilities, but not every farmer is excited about having robots in the barn. I'm Jay Gabler of Forum Communications, and this is Plain Money Talk, a podcast all about your financial life and the things that are affecting it today. In this episode, I'm joined by Lynn Paulson, Director of Agribusiness Development at Bell Bank. He's going to talk about how automation is changing the work and the economics of farming, and how that's affecting those of us who don't grow food, we just buy it. He'll also tell us about upcoming opportunities to learn a lot more about the changing agricultural economy. Lynn, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Well, we start these episodes with 5 fast questions. So if you don't mind, I'll whip 5 quick questions at you and you can, answer each one as, concisely as reasonably possible. And then we'll talk about some of these topics in a little bit more depth.
Fire away.
Okay, here we go. Question 1. About what percentage of Americans today work in agriculture?
It's kind of a two-part question. Number one, there's only about 1% of the population actually are active farmers and ranchers. But when you take a look at the broader picture of agriculture and the number of people it employs, it's probably closer to 10%.
Oh, interesting. So what are those other roles that fill out that 10%? Sorry, I know I'm going against the ethos of the quick question, but I'm just curious to learn a little more.
No, it's people who work on farms, it's people who process the food, it's the people who, the trucks that take it to the supermarket, it's the tentacles that go out from the farm or the ranch.
Got it. Absolutely. Okay. Understood. All right. Well, let's move on to question 2. So here in the upper Midwest, what are our principal agricultural products?
The primary ones, of course, are corn and soybeans and wheat. In the Red River Valley here in Fargo and up and down, there's a lot of sugar beets and other specialty crops. As you get further east and west of the valley, obviously you get into a little bit more of livestock operations, right? Cow-calf producers out west, and you get into Minnesota, you've got some confinement of hogs and dairy and poultry. So it's a very diversified subset of agriculture.
Great. Yeah, obviously agriculture is not as huge a part of the economy up here in northeastern Minnesota. I'm in Duluth, as in other parts of the state in the upper Midwest. But you mentioned those beets. We definitely have the beet pellets come through Duluth Harbor here.
Yeah.
Well, next quick question. About what proportion of food purchased in the Midwest is grown here? I know it's probably a complicated answer, but what's sort of the most concise way to give me a sense of when I'm filling my shopping cart here in Duluth, about what proportion of food comes from this area of the country?
You could say about 50%, about half, right? But when you get into specialty things like fruit and vegetables, whatever, it's probably like 10 or 20%. But from a grocery standpoint, when you go through the grocery line, it's about 25%.
Well, that's higher than I would have assumed. Yeah, I know in a globalized economy, stuff comes and goes all over the place. Again, we have those salties coming and going through Duluth. So we're well aware of the global economy, but that's always interesting that much of our food here comes right from the area. So next quick question. This is getting a little more lighthearted, but important to know. If I want to fit in on a farm, do I refer to a pickup truck as a pickup or a truck?
Well, if you're a farmer or rancher, anything with 4 wheels is a pickup, right? A truck is something that you generally would haul stuff in, and whether it be, 6, 8, 10, 18 wheelers, whatever, that's a truck. But for most farmers and ranchers, if it's got 4 wheels, it's a pickup.
All right, I'm gonna keep that one in my pocket. Good to know. Thank you, Lynn. All right, last quick question. And this is for all, in case we have any listeners out there in their car seats who are of the old McDonald age. What's your favorite farm animal, Lynn?
It's a good old loyal farm dog.
I love that. Why dog?
Yeah, why dogs? They'll follow you. They'll heed you. They'll chase cattle. They'll do what they want, and as long as you pet them and feed them, you can't replace a good old loyal farm dog.
That's great. Well, no one asked me, but I'm going to ask myself. And my answer to this question is companion, well, maybe frenemy to the dog, the farm cat.
Yeah.
You keep it in the barn, doesn't demand much of you, kind of like a dog, maybe even a little less than a dog, I'm just going to say, takes care of your mouse problem. Well, thanks for humoring us there, Lynn. Now let's get to know you a little bit more. Now, you mentioned Fargo. Is that where you're based?
I actually am in Fargo, and I've been in Fargo for the last 15 years.
Okay. And how'd you get into your line of work?
It's kind of interesting. I actually grew up on a small, diversified farm in central North Dakota, right? I mean, we had hogs, we had chickens, we had dairy, we had beef. We raised, we raised small grains and hay and everything else. I don't think our grocery bill was very high because pretty much everything we ate, we raised. So from there, I went to NDSU and I graduated in ag education. And then from there, I became a VOAG teacher for a couple of years. And then I ended up back on the family farm in a dairy operation. And I did that for 2-3 years. And then I actually had a fire that destroyed my barn and setup, whatever. So I put my education to use and I got into banking. I started with the farm credit system in the 1980s, early 80s, and if you know anything about the history of economics and agriculture, that was probably the biggest crisis that we've had in agriculture in the last century, right? But it was a great time to learn. I mean, either they kind of threw you into the deep end of the pool and you either learn how to swim or you sank. And from there, I was approached to start a new bank in Grafton, North Dakota. So I didn't know anything or a lot about banking, but I started a new bank and I grew that. And then I later merged 4 banks and 3 holding companies into what is now Choice Bank. And they were probably the largest ag bank in North Dakota. And about 15 years ago, I left to join Bell Bank. And I kind of oversee most of the agricultural area, both on the direct side, and we talk about direct side, it's loans that we make directly to producers, but we also have a large correspondent area where we do a lot of bank-to-bank business, right? So we do business with about 300 banks across the Midwest. A lot of them are ag banks, and we purchase a lot of loans, ag loans. So our expertise and our footprint gets to be pretty broad, right? So we get to see a lot of different things and can form a fair amount of opinions based on what we're seeing.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that, when you were younger, you were able to actually provide a lot of your own family's needs right there on the farm. And it kind of touches on the topic of my next question I was going to ask. So for listeners who don't know much about the agriculture industry today, we know the model of a classic family farm. Then this idea of sort of, as you described, like you're growing the food, you're selling the food, you can sort of provide for yourselves as well. To what extent is that still the reality today in terms of how farms are organized and operated typically?
It's a great question, Jay. I would say the family farm is still there, right? USDA, the Department of Agriculture, still says that 95 to 98% of the farms are still family owned and operated, right? We still have this Norman Rockwell perception in our brain, right, about what a family farm should be. So, but what has changed is scale, right? It's the size of the family farm. Family farm now is thousands of acres. You got multiple family members. You got multiple generations, right? You can have 3-4 generations on a farm. They have millions of dollars in equipment. As you mentioned, they can be organized into LLCs, partnerships, corporations, and they're very sophisticated for the most part. So what people think is family farms, it depends on your perspective, right? It still can be the 500-acre farm operation where, somebody lives on the farm and they work off farm. But you have some family farm operations that are, 10, 20, 30,000 acres, right? And they still would call themselves family farm because they're all family members that run it.
Interesting. Well, I would ask you a follow-up regarding why that is happening, why that scale is changing, but I feel like I might be scooping what we'll be talking about a little bit later in the episode in terms of changes in automation. So maybe I'll just hold on.
Okay.
But before we take a break to hear from our sponsor, I'd love to hear your take, Lynn, on just sort of overall right now, how is the agricultural economy doing?
I've been doing this for about 45 years, and this is the most bifurcated ag economy that I've seen. And when I say that, the grain, we'll call it the grain sector. If you're growing corn and wheat and soybeans and things like that, these are pretty stiff headwinds out there right now due to a lot of factors. You have trade and tariffs and geopolitical events and weather and interest rates and all those types of things that are headwinds. So there's some challenges in the grain sector. Conversely, on the livestock side, the protein side, these are some of the best times ever. I mean, if you're a cow-calf operator right now, these are generational type of profits. And a lot of it comes down to protein, so whether you're in hogs or dairy or beef, protein has become the buzzword, right? GLP-1s are a big part of that, right? I mean, people really want that protein. You can buy protein Doritos, protein Cheerios, whatever. So so if you're in the protein sector, which typically is in the animal sector, these are pretty good times.
I would not have guessed that when I buy a protein bar at my local supermarket, I'm helping the agricultural economy all that much. But of course I am, huh?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you, Lynn, for explaining that. Let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsor, Bell Bank.
Behind every moment, there's a feeling of happiness, of security. Behind every dream, there's a spark. With every challenge, there's a safety net. Behind every victory, there's a team. Behind every moment, there's Bell Bank.
And we're back on Plain Money Talk with our guest, Lynn Paulson. Lynn, thanks again for being with us.
You bet.
Here at the midpoint of the episode, we like to sort of take a pause from the Q&A format and think about the topic from a different perspective. And today, for this episode, I'm thinking about an event that happened last year in Minneapolis, here in Minnesota. There was a huge concert marking the 40th anniversary of Farm Aid. Willie Nelson, Neil Young, John Mellencamp, Minnesota's own Bob Dylan, and more artists performed at Huntington Bank Stadium in Minneapolis to raise money to support farmers. It was inspiring, but at the same time, it was an anniversary the founders maybe hoped they wouldn't have had to celebrate. The fact that Farm Aid has been happening for 40 years speaks to the fact that farmers have needed help for 40 years. Lynn, given your professional expertise, I wonder if you could share your thoughts on what your concerns are regarding the economic well-being of the agricultural community today and what's giving you reason for hope right now.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I think my biggest concern, Jay, what's going on in the ag sector, and it's not unique to the ag sector, right? But it's the consolidation that's happening all across all ag sectors, whether it be farms or land ownership or agribusinesses. I believe this country was built on entrepreneurship and small businesses, right? And that's really what's created a lot of the innovation. And I worry a little bit about some of that being stifled with all the consolidation. But the genie's out of the bottle. You're not going to put that back in, right? I mean, you're not going to go back to the small farms, and that's only going to accelerate. I worry a little bit about how politicians and policymakers often weaponize agriculture. Agriculture is often the tip of the spear when it comes time for trade and things like that. We're kind of a pawn in a big game. One of my big concerns, though, is the demographics, right? There's 2 times as many farmers over 75 years old than under 35. And the average age of the farmer is about 60 years old. And we've got a huge intergenerational transfer here coming. And I don't know if we're necessarily prepared for that. Only 50% of the farmers that are getting ready to retire have a succession plan, right? I mean, how they're going to leave it to the next generation, whether it be a farming heir or a non-farming heir. But when you take a look at farmland, about 70% of it is owned by people 65 or older, right? 36% is owned by people 75 and older. And again, there's going to be a huge intergenerational transfer of wealth. And when we're talking wealth, there's about $4 trillion of farmland out there that's going to be changing. So, I mean, we see it coming, but I don't know that the industry as a whole is prepared for that.
Well, I know there's a lot of incredible agricultural education that happens up in the Fargo area. Do you think that's part of the solution to help use the institutions of education to draw young people into the industry?
Yeah, no question about it, because I think there's a great future. Now, if you're a young person starting in farming, it's very difficult to get started if you're not born into it, right? Or if you have a family member. The capital requirements are just so high. It doesn't mean that it can't be done, but it's fairly difficult. So, but that is one of my hopes, I guess, for agriculture is young producers coming in. They're smart. They're open to new ideas. They're very transparent about telling the story, right, about what they do. Older farmers, in include myself, we're pretty independent. It's one of those things where what I do in the farm is none of your business, right? I mean, but for the American consumer, they want it to be their business. They want to know how their food is raised. They want to know where it comes from. There's a great story to tell out there, Jay, if farmers are willing to tell it, because the consumers want to hear it. They want to hear it from farm producers, right? I think one of the things that gives me hope, it's kind of a knife that cuts both ways, but a lot of the automation and technology that we'll talk about, the future of AI and technology, and I honestly think we're in the first or second inning of a 9-inning game. I don't think we've even begun to know what it can do. And the key is you got to have the proper guardrails around it, right? And make sure that you're doing the right thing. I think the last thing though is if you're a producer, if you're a rancher, I don't care if you're 25 or 85. I mean, the connection to the land is phenomenal, right? And my wife and I are landowners, right? I own the family farm back in central North Dakota. We've got some land holdings up in northeastern North Dakota. Next to my family, that land is the most important thing in my life, right? I mean, and I've taken steps to preserve that legacy. So, my dad always used to say, if you take care of the land will take care of you. And I think they are awesome stewards of the land. And sometimes that story doesn't necessarily get told either.
Yeah. Wait, well, let's talk about those changes, some of that technology, some of that change in scale that we've been discussing. So, of course, the idea that technology is affecting farming is not new at all. Technology has always shaped how farming is done, from ancient irrigation development to the Industrial Revolution to the present day. So, Lynn, when we're talking about new automation being developed and brought into use today, what kind of technologies are we talking about, and how new are they?
Yeah, some of them, we talk about the automation in farm equipment. They call it auto steer or GPS or self-driving or autonomous tractors. Some of that technology's been out there for a while, but when you get to fully autonomous equipment, whatever, I think the technology is there. I don't know if the rest of the agricultural sector is ready for that. For example, I mean, you can have autonomous combines and trucks, whatever, but you got to make sure you have autonomous roads, right? So I think a lot of that is already out there. It becomes more and more refined. You have precision agriculture. You've got what satellites can do, satellite imagery and drones and data analytics. It's part of it is that you're drowning in data but starving for information, right? It's like you got all this data, but how can you put it into usable that's going to, improve my bottom line. You have robotics. If you're in the fruit and vegetable industry, robotics is a big part of that, right? If you're in the dairy industry, you got robotic milkers that are doing a phenomenal job, and they just keep getting better and better as 1.0, 2.0, 3.0 comes out. But I think we're just scratching the surface of what's to come. You have AI that can predict disease, it can predict animal health, it can predict, it can assist in decision making. So it's a really exciting time to see where all of this goes. But it's only going to make producers more efficient and hopefully keep drive down the cost of food, or at least keep the lid on the cost, because technology has always helped control costs at the producer level. And given that only probably 11 cents out of every dollar that you spend at the supermarket comes back into the farmer's pocket, right? It's a pretty important deal.
Yeah. So we're going way beyond the Roomba combine.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I mean they link up combines and grain carts and everything else is automated, and you just got to get out of the way.
I love what you said about drowning in data, starving for information. It takes me back to when I was studying sociology about 20 years ago, and it was the point where sociologists and other social scientists were moving beyond just having to survey people to find out what was going on, and really just getting tons and tons of data on everyday movements and transactions. And I remember sociologists realizing that having access to, theoretically, every credit card transaction happening in a city on any given day is not necessarily going to make it easier to answer your questions regarding what's going on in that society, in that economy. It's going to give you a lot of data, but you still have to know to ask the right questions.
Exactly. And really, the cool thing about all of it, it's real-time information, right? It's not looking in the rearview mirror. It's all real-time.
Yeah. So there have always been concerns, not just in agriculture, but across the economy, that automation will eliminate jobs. But I understand that in the case of agriculture, changes in the job market are also driving changes in automation rather than just the other way around. Can you explain how that is, Lynn?
I think farmers are not asking how can we replace workers, they're asking where can we find workers, right? There's fewer kids on the farm. I grew up in a family of 5 kids, and I know my parents loved all of us, but we were pretty free and cheap labor, right? My grandparents had 11 kids, whatever. Now kids are an expense. So it's changed the dynamics a little bit. And not only just labor, but qualified labor to handle all this sophisticated equipment out there, right? I mean, you got $1 million combine, and that's not an exaggeration. Combines are $1 million, right? Especially in rural areas, but they're looking to find automation that can drive repetitive tasks. So I think it's less about replacing workers and more about helping farmers manage more acres, more livestock, more information. But when looking at automation, I think agriculture faces 3 simultaneous trends, right? One is the aging population, or producer population that we talked about. We have a shrinking rural labor pool, and we have larger and more complex organizations to deal with. So, it's not that automation primary goal is to force labor out. It's more of a function of they didn't have enough labor. I mean, that's why equipment got bigger, and things like that. And you couldn't run 4 combines because you didn't have 4 people running them. So you have one large combine that can do the work of 4. So it's probably more from that standpoint that has driven automation than just strictly to reduce headcount.
So the farmers you're working with would love to have more labor force available to them, is what I'm hearing.
No question about it. And that's why, things like the H-2A program, whatever, to bring in foreign workers that have good agricultural backgrounds. I know the people that farm our land back in Benson County, their H-2A workers are from Ukraine, right? I mean, very, very, but they couldn't find local people to do that. So they're taking other avenues to find qualified people to help them on the farm.
For those of us who don't work directly in the agriculture business, I'd be curious to learn a little more about how all these changes are affecting the availability of food and the prices we pay at the grocery store. So, how are all these changes playing out at the consumer level?
I think in a positive manner, right? I don't think it's in a negative manner whatsoever. As I mentioned, I think automation and efficiency should help drive down or at least keep the lid on prices for consumers. Agriculture is always downstream from consumers, and I think that's an important point. I mean, the consumer still drives a bus, right? And farmers and ranchers need to provide, we talked about the protein and GLP-1s and the demand, right, for that. But again, I come back to the producer's share of the consumer dollar spent on food is only like 10 or 11 cents. So if you're concerned about the price of food or all those type of things, you probably not only need to look at the farm level, but you need to look at all those other things that, the processing and the transportation and all those other people that get the cut in between. But I think it gives a huge benefit to the consumer to have a lot more transparency into how their food is grown. And I'll take Frito-Lay, for example. I have some customers that grow potatoes for Frito-Lay. If you buy a bag of Frito-Lay potato chips, there's a QR code, I believe, in the back, and you can click on that, and it'll give you history down to where those potatoes were growing, right? I mean, and how they were growing, those types of things. So, more and more consumers want to know, and rightfully so, about the safety of their food and processed and foods and items like that. So this really gives you, kind of from farm to table about how their food is raised and where it comes from.
Yeah. So, the farmers that you're working with, Lynn, if they could name a thing or two that ordinary consumers could do, that they would like to see consumers do to support agriculture in the community, what would they like to see us do as consumers?
I think understand what the producer's role is in the food that they're buying, right? I mean, there are a lot of things that are outside the control of the producer by the time it gets to the grocery store or to your plate. And I think that's why some of the, one of the niche markets that are doing really well in agriculture is the small roadside farms, whatever, that are growing things, on a limited basis, limited acres, but they're selling directly to consumers. Those things play really, really well. And as much as we can narrow up that chain on a larger scale, I think that'd be hugely beneficial.
So, at the beginning of the episode, I promised Lynn that you would tell listeners about how they can learn a lot more about what's happening with the agricultural economy today. So, what can you tell us about your upcoming Ag Views Live conferences?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. This is something that we've done now for 12 years, and it's an annual event. We're doing it on July 20th in Fargo, the 21st in Mankato, Minnesota, and the 22nd in Wisconsin Dells, Wisconsin. I partner up with Dr. Dave Cole, and Dave Cole is the unrivaled top expert in ag finance in the country, and he has been for a long, long time, right? If you haven't heard Dave Cole, you'd want to hear him, and if you've heard him, you know you want to come back because he is his energy and his entertaining. He just brings it down to a grassroots level, and it's something that really don't want to miss. And I guess one other point, it goes way beyond the farm gate, right? I mean, obviously we talk about things in agriculture, but if you live in the Midwest, you're connected to agriculture one way or the other, whether you know it or not, right? So I think it's an event that you want to attend. And the last thing is we're not selling anything. All we're doing is providing information and education. It's just a kind of a frank, as Dr. Cole said, between him and I, it's an unfiltered presentation, right? I mean, and the cool thing about that is, Dave, at the end, we take about an hour, hour and a half, and we call it our our ESPN hot seat. We just take questions from the audience, whatever, and we don't know what's coming, but we'll take on all questions. And that really has become probably the most popular part of the program. But if you're interested in attending, you can just go to Bell's website and just click on bell.bank/agviews-live to register.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Lynn. That sounds like a great series of events that people would be really excited to know about if they were interested. And I don't know how they could not be in our conversation today. I'm not surprised to hear that you are experienced at taking questions from an audience because you've really rolled with everything I've tossed at you today, Lynn. I've really appreciated your time. We have one last question for you. This is a question we ask each of our guests at the end of the episode. It's the same question. What is one piece of financial advice you wish you'd been given a long time ago?
The power of compounding interest. As Albert Einstein once said, it's the eighth wonder of the world.
And that means save early and often to the extent that you can.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, great. Thank you for sharing that simple but powerful advice, Lynn, and your perspective on everything going on with the agricultural economy today. And thanks to everybody who tuned in for this episode of Plain Money Talk. If you enjoyed this episode of Plain Money Talk and want to hear more about what's happening in agriculture, join us at Ag Views Live, Bell Bank's free annual ag seminar this July. Agriculture is facing challenging conditions, and the time is now for farmers and ranchers to take action and make tough decisions. Lynn Paulson and ag finance author and speaker Dr. David Cole will break down what they're seeing in the ag economy and share practical strategies to help you plan for what's next. Join Bell in Fargo on July 20th, Mankato on July 21st, or Wisconsin Dells on July 22nd. For more information and to sign up, visit bell.bank/agviews-live. Bell Bank, member FDIC.